All right, everyone. Welcome to session number 4, data collection, graphing, and data analysis. The things that we're going to be chatting about today are the purposes of a graph, the basic elements of a graph. I'm going to have you do some independent practice, and as well as talk about some visual analysis on how we look at the data that we have collected and are using for our project. So if you have any questions, comments, and/or concerns about anything, please go ahead and feel free to reach out and we can set something up to chat. So what's the purpose of a graph, right? We talk about graphing our data all the time, but why is it so important? Well, it provides a simple means for organizing massive amounts of data that we've collected and to simplify that data set for evaluation. So how can we look at that and make decisions about it? It allows us to do ongoing evaluation of the intervention and its effectiveness on what we're working on, and to serve as a communication tool among the many professionals and relevant parties that you'll be talking about the students' progress with. Now, there are some basic elements of a line graph that you need to be aware of, and I know that this might sound kind of silly, but there was a study done, and it's one of the readings that you had for this week by Cabina and colleagues, where they examined one of the most prestigious journals in the world of behavior, JABA, or the Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis, and they found that many of the graphs in that journal were missing some of these basic elements of a graph, which is astounding to me. It's just unbelievable. So I'll have an image on the next slide that shows you where all of these things fall. But the elements that we need to be paying attention to or including in our graphs are the axes, and these are the boundaries of the graph. Pardon me. We have our x-axis, and this is the horizontal axis on the graph, our x-axis. And this shows how many times the data were collected. And this needs to be in a time unit. Days, weeks, and even sessions. Sessions I'm not a huge fan of unless we label how long that session was. So if you do 45-minute sessions, it should say 45-minute sessions. If we just say session, it's kind of hard for us to interpret that without the additional qualifying information. Then we have our vertical axis or the y-axis. And this graph shows us what the target behavior is. So the number of correct steps completed, correctly, the percentage of time engaged on a task, the number of talkouts, et cetera, et cetera. That y-axis is focusing on the behavior. We also have the data points, which are our small geometric shapes or forms, typically a shaded dot, but it could be squares and triangles. And this represents the occurrence of the behavior on that specific day, how much we collected for that day. We also have our data paths, which are the solid lines that connect all of the data points. And we also have phase change lines. And that phase change line is a vertical line that separates data points between two phases. So like if we have baseline data, we'd put a phase change line in, and then we would have our intervention data. And again, I'll show you those on the next slide. Let's see. Oh, and we also need to have labels for all of our things on our graph. So we have to have a label for the x-axis, right? We want to put underneath that x-axis what that time unit is, on the y-axis, what the behavior is. And then for the phase labels, we want to name those phases, be it baseline and intervention. So here's an image of that, of all of those critical aspects or features of a line graph. So you can see here we have our y-axis, including the label for it. For this example, we have frequency of talking out. Also, you can see we have equal intervals within our graph, right? We want to make sure that the intervals are equal. If not, it can skew what you're actually looking at. We have our x-axis and label, right? So we have a 60-minute session. As you noticed, I've said we need to have a qualifier if we use the term sessions. We want to include the student's name, so I used my name here. We need to have tick marks, and the tick marks need to be facing out. We don't want those tick marks facing into the graph or crossing over the line, because it's just more stuff on the chart or on the panels that can get in the way of our visual analysis. We see here we have our condition labels, so baseline and intervention. This is our phase change line that I had mentioned, right? It falls between days, not on days. And then we see here we have our data points and our data path that connects those points. And what you're noticing here, hopefully, is that the data path does not connect across phase change lines, right? You'll end the data point for baseline and start a new section there in intervention. The data path does not cross the phase change line. So we need to think about transferring data to graphs. So we need to determine the unit count of the observed behavior. So what dimension of behavior are we looking at? Frequency, rate, duration, latency, inter response time. Any of those dimensions that you have selected that you're using for your measurement, that's going to be reflected on, that's going to be reflected on the y-axis. Then we want to separate baseline and intervention data again, and any additional subsequent phases where we make a change with that phase change line. And again, that data path does not cross over the phase change line. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to look at what you're going to do is pause this video and you're going to create a couple of graphs. Now, remember that there is a video on Canvas that I walk through on how to create a graph within Excel. If you're using Google or Google Drive or anything to that effect, it's not going to work as effectively as Excel does. As a JMU student, you get Excel for free. You get the Microsoft Suite for free. If you do not have that, I highly suggest downloading it because I'm not much help when it comes to the Google charts and making graphs within Google because it's a little bit different and kind of hard to find certain things. So as you're going through and practicing on these graphs, you want to make sure that you have your axes labeled, you're using appropriate increments, right? So equal intervals, the data are plotted correctly, the value of 0 is raised at the y-axis, value 0 is crossed at the x-axis, but there's no 0 for the x-axis. Maximum value on the x-axis and y-axis scales reflects potential maximum values. Again, have that break in the data between the baseline and intervention, have that phase change line, and label those conditions. So here will be your first practice, and you can hand draw this graph for your practice. So hand draw a graph for trans quiet hand raising based on the following information. The dimension is frequency. We collected that data using event recording, and there are 10 total data points. You can see here, boom, 10. Everything above this red line is your baseline data. Everything below it is the intervention data, which was self-monitoring in this instance. So you want to go ahead, pause the video, and go ahead and write this out by hand. When you come back, I'll flip over the slides and you can see what your graph's going to look like. So go ahead and pause the video and write this graph out by hand. Okay, so welcome back. So you have now graphed your data and it should look something like this, right? So we have our y-axis with the numbers. It's labeled with number of quiet hand raises, which is a frequency count. We have our condition labels. We have our data points. We have our data paths. We have the tick marks facing out. You can see we have equal intervals on both the y and x-axis. Labeled as sessions. Trina's name is on there. So we have all of the things that we need to have on our graph. Here is the next graph that you are going to create by hand. So you want to hand draw a graph for Robert's off-task behavior based on the following information. So the data collection method here was a momentary time sampling. So it was observed every 30 seconds for 10 minutes, which equals 20 total intervals during that time. You want to graph the percentage of intervals of off task. So for example, 10 out of 20 intervals will be 50%. Number of data points are 10. So as you can see, we have our baseline data here, and we have our tokens for on task here. So go ahead, pause this video, and go ahead and hand draw this graph. Make sure you're converting these. This is our percent. Oh, sorry for the typo. This is our percentage. and then go ahead and graph that data. And then come back and you can check your work. So go ahead and pause the video and we'll flip over here in a moment. And here we are. Here is our what our data should look like. And I'm sorry, this should be 14, not 114. I just realized that. So if you have an error on your graph, that's my fault and not yours. So you should see our data looking something like this. So once we have graphed our data, we need to make sure that we're looking at it scientifically on how we make changes. And the way that we do that with line graphs and single case research is a visual analysis. And the purpose of visual analysis is to determine if a meaningful change in the behavior occurred as the result of the intervention that we put in place. So the way that you do this is the first thing that you do is you calculate the mean for each condition. So you can see here, we look at the baseline data points down in this example, mean equals 9.3 right there. And then for intervention, we see our data points and we get a mean of 3.2. And we see a dramatic change in that level. So we calculate the average, draw that horizontal dashed line, compare those changes between each phase and indicate, and I already mentioned about the horizontal line. So we can see there's a significant change in level there. And what level refers to is the magnitude and direction of change, often related to, again, the mean or average. And if we see an abrupt change in level in the right direction, this is an indication of the effectiveness of that intervention. We also need to look at trend, and this refers to the overall direction that the data path is moving. It's represented with a straight line drawn through the data. So this is our trend line. You can see a trend line right there indicated in this red dashed line. Any changes in direction in the therapeutic or direction we would like to see it also indicates that there is significant change, or at least some type of change related to the intervention that we have put in place. And then what we need to do is look at the stability or variability of the data. And basically what this means is how much is that data bouncing up and down? The more bounce it has, the less control we have over it. The tighter that data is, or the least amount of variability, is the better, is better. So here are some examples of how you would describe level. And this is how you need to describe your data in your projects as well. So you can see level can be referred to as high level if it's sitting here, moderate if it's sitting here, and low if it's sitting here. Remember, we're using the mean to do that. So you're gonna have high level, moderate level, low level, or some people like to break it down even further with some of these other qualifiers here, moderate to high level or low to moderate level. So we're going to walk through this together and analyze the data patterns in graphs A through F. So we're going to look at level. Is it high or low? Is the trend increasing, decreasing, or no trend? And are the data stable or variable? And some of those descriptive phrases, which are similar to what you will use in your project, could be something like increasing, low level, stable, high level, decreasing, variable, high level, stable with no trend, stable with no trend, and low level. So let's have a look at our first set. So we have graph A, and let's go ahead and figure out how you would phrase this. So go ahead and think about that for a second. So we would say that these data are stable. There's not a ton of bounce at the mid-level, and there's no trend. It's not going up or down. It's staying relatively flat. Well, let's look at this set of data. Go ahead and think about how you would describe this. So here we would describe these data as variable at a mid-level, because remember, we're going to look at the mean, and there's really not much of a trend there. Let's look at C. So remember, we're doing the average. So how would you describe these? We would call it an increasing trend at about a mid-level, and the data are still fairly stable. Here's our next graph. Let's see how we would describe these data. Go ahead and think about what you would do or how you would refer to these data. So we have an increasing trend, again, probably sitting at that mid-level, and the data are variable here, incredibly variable. Let's look at graph E. How would you describe these data? So we have a decreasing trend at mid-level, and the data are variable. There is some up and down, some peaks and valleys, some bounce to these data. And for this final graph for this portion of our practice, how would you describe these data here? So if you said something like a decreasing trend at mid-level and stable, you'd be correct. So we're going to do a little bit more practice, but now we're going to have our baseline and intervention data where we are going to describe both sets of data. An example phrase here would be, in baseline, we have an increasing variable trend, and in intervention, we have data that's set at a low level with a stable trend or stable and no trend. So let's go ahead and look at this one, and we'll go through this one first before I have you come up with it. So the data here would be described as having an increasing trend in baseline at a mid-level, and it's pretty stable. And then during intervention, we see a decreasing trend, which is stable, and there's really no change in level. If we looked at the mean of both of these, the level is going to be about the same. So there's no change in level there. We'll do one more here as an example before I ask you to think about some other ones. So our baseline data here would be stable at the mid-level with no trend, and our intervention data would be at a higher level that is stable with no trend. So let's look at graph I here. Now this graph is meant to be kind of tricky. We just don't have enough information here to describe what's going on. We have missing data points. But here at J, we're able to describe these data using our visual analysis. So how would you phrase these? I'll give you a few seconds to think this through before I pull up the answer. So go ahead and think this through. Okay, so we have in baseline some stable data at a mid to low level with no trend. And then in intervention, we have an increasing trend, and the data are fairly stable, and it is at a higher level. For K, how would you describe these data in both of these phases? Okay, let's see what you came up with and see if it matches what I came up with. So we have data in baseline that are at a low level, that are stable with zero trend. And then we have intervention data that has changed level to a higher level. The data are variable, and there's really no significant trend in that data. Let's look at L. How would you describe these data? So we have an increasing stable trend in both panels of this graph in baseline and intervention. And what this tells me when I see this data is that we don't know if what we did is working, right? Because the data were already increasing, right? So if this is my student and I'm doing something to increase maybe work completion or on-task behavior, whatever it might be, if I'm seeing this behavior starting to creep up, I'm not even putting an intervention in yet. I'm just going to continue to track that data to see if it's just increasing on its own. And if it is, right on, I don't have to do the intervention. We have two more to look at here. So how would you describe these data in baseline and these data in intervention? So go ahead and think about that for a moment. Okay. So as you can see here, our data are at low level, they are variable, and there's really not much trend here in baseline. And then we look at our intervention data, it is at a high level with not really any variability and zero trend. And our final graph here, how would you describe that baseline and intervention data using our visual analysis terminology? So we would have here, the data are at a high level, variable with no trend. And then in intervention, we have the data are at a low level, they are variable, and we see maybe a slight decreasing trend here. And that's how we use our visual analysis. That's how you need to be describing the data that you find on your in your work as a professional educator, and also what the terms that you'll need to use when you're writing up the parts of your project. So now that we have some experience handwriting graphs, including those critical features, as well as analyzing those graphs, your task is to graph the data that I'm going to show you here with Excel. So you're going to create two sets of graphs using the data that I have provided. Now, the first set, we are going to do it together. This is the video that is posted in Canvas. So go ahead and open that up and work with me through that process of graphing the first set of data. And then the second set, you're on your own to go ahead and complete that graph. If you need help, you can reach out to me. There are two separate task analyses on file in Canvas if you need additional help. As I mentioned, the recorded demo is there as well. And I highly suggest using this whenever you create a graph, not just for this class, but outside of it as well. So here are the data that you'll do together with me. Your Excel sheet should look something like this. As I mentioned, this is all in the recording in much deeper explanation on how to do these things. And your graph should look something like this. Again, this is all in that recording. And then what you'll do is you will make your own graph using these data here, remembering this is baseline and then this is intervention. And that's all I have for you today. So I appreciate everyone's kind words and hard work in this class, and thank you for being accommodating to me being sick last night. Still not feeling 100%, but a little bit better, so I do appreciate it. I just didn't think I'd be able to get through the entire class last night, so thank you. And if you need anything, please reach out. I'm working through my emails later on today. If anybody needs anything, please go ahead and reach out. So thank you for everything, and I will catch you all in 2 weeks. So thank you.